Okay, guys, the internet is about to blow up because the king of satire and the queen of satire have just gotten together. Andrew Doyle, how are you, sir?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Real pleasure. For those of you who don't know who Andrew Doyle is, he is a writer, he is a comedian, but we got to know one another because you've created a very successful and hilarious and powerful and poignant parody account called Titania. Is that how you would pronounce it?
Yeah, Titania, yeah.
Uh,
Titania McGrath, because she's based on, the name is based on Titania from Midsummer Night's Dream, Queen of the Fairies.
right, got you.
Yeah.
So well, that addresses the question of why you chose that name. So forgive my ignorance for not having known that reference. Now, were you also, and again, forgive me if I'm asking a dumb question, were you also the creator or the man behind the previous highly successful satirical, the Godfrey Elfwick? Was that you?
Godfrey Elfwick. No, I was not. And actually, the Godfrey Elfwick account, that inspired me to do what I do, because I saw that for many, many years that was going, and it was great. And it was run by a satirist called Lisa Graves with another satirist who wants to remain nameless. There were two of them worked on it together. And he was a genderqueer Muslim atheist, you know, that character, and has been completely banned from Twitter, like totally nuked, you know, and can't come back. In fact, he came back. I know Lisa brought him back about 2 months ago and was banned again in 4 days' time. So the people at Twitter really hate him.
And what was the justification for having banned the account?
Well, they say now, of course, if he comes back, he's evading an account suspension. They have this wonderful semantic contradiction of a permanent suspension. But they say that, he came back and they can't have him back anymore because he violated the terms of service. But as you know, the problem with Twitter's terms of service is it's so nebulous. It could mean absolutely anything, which is why we continually get this situation where more right-leaning or conservative accounts are censored more heavily, or shadow banned, or whatever you want to call it. And the problem with Godfrey Elfwick is that people perceive him to be attacking the left. Certainly, he's poking fun at the social justice movement, which is what I do with Titania. I go after the same targets. Right. But just in a different way with a different characterization. That's the thing. They clearly don't. I mean, Titania's been banned a few times. I got permanently banned, and I had the email saying you're permanently banned, you can't come back. And then lots of people kicked up a fuss about it, and then they sent me an email saying, "Oh, we made a mistake, you can come back." Which was great because it really boosted the account. It's the Streisand effect.
Right. The only thing that ever got me temporarily suspended was in interacting with an individual. I think he lives in Australia, and he had insulted me. And so once in a while, I put on the gloves, I roll back the sleeves, and I just spar for fun. And I had called him, I think, a retarded, degenerate schmuck. And
right.
And apparently
everything's your words.
Right. Well, the R word you can't say on retarded, you cannot say. And that got me banned for 12 hours.
Right, exactly. So they've got this thing about healthy conversation. That's the really chilling phrase they use, healthy conversation. It's almost as chilling as their group that sort of monitor all this are called the Trust and Safety Council.
Right.
I mean, if you wanted to come up with a more overtly dystopian phrase, I don't know how you would do that. So well done. Ultimately, the problem is that the people at Twitter are humorless ideologues, and they don't want anyone mocking their worldview. They by Jack Dorsey's own admission, they are left leaning. And they don't want to be mocked, and it means that accounts like mine tend to get banned, or people who use the wrong words get banned. There's a simple solution to this: let everyone say what they want to say, and people can just use the block button or the mute button. I mean, that's a simple way around it, as far as I can see. I don't like to block people, but if they're insane and there's absolutely no point to having a conversation with them, then that's the simple solution.
Before we come back to how you sort of what compelled you to start doing this and so on, just a quick sort of historical point. I'm currently working on my next book, and I have a section in it which tentatively is titled "The Power of Satire," where I begin to describe, all of the different persuasive weaponry that I use in trying to weigh in on the battle of ideas. One of which, of course, is satire, sarcasm, irony. But I briefly have a section where I describe previous, people, historical figures that have been known, and so I just listed some names here. Some of their work I actually don't even know, so I'm really trying to familiarize myself. So of course, Horace, Aristophanes, And I'm ashamed to say that I only found out who Aristophanes was because someone referred to me as the modern Aristophanes. And so
Really?
maybe it was my ego that said, oh, well, let me go find out who this guy is. And then I started reading about him, and he was incredibly satirical. Juvenal in ancient Rome, François Rabelais, Jonathan Swift, Mark Twain, Ambrose Bierce, George Orwell, Oscar Wilde, and so on and so forth. So do you agree that satire, the term that I use, is that satire is akin to the surgeon's scalpel because it cuts through bullshit like butter? Is that why you use it?
Yeah, absolutely. Because there's a really good definition by the poet W.H. Auden, and he talks about how the difference between satire and comedy is that satire is angry and optimistic, in that it feels it can make a change in the world. It can actually affect some kind of change. Whereas comedy is pessimistic. It's resigned to the absurdity of the world and it's just going to mock it, but doesn't think it's going to get any better, you know? So, and that I think is a really helpful way to look at it. Like with satire, I think it's always, it does have a political agenda. You know, it is trying to normally deflate the pretensions of the powerful, right? To all those people you just mentioned, it's pricking away at the powerful. And sometimes that's funny. You know, and as in the case of, say, Gulliver's Travels by Swift, it's a very funny book. Sometimes it's not humorous, but it's still satirical, like Huckleberry Finn, for instance, which is basically showing, you know, the morality of all these people who want to civilize this boy, and actually he's the one who can pierce through all the nonsense and recognize that the essence of humanity beyond all that, and that's what I think satire is good for. So I use satire to kick up against who I perceive are the ones in power, and I see that as the woke social justice movement. I don't know what you think about that, because that's the debate I'm having with a lot of people. Right. A lot of people who misinterpret what I'm doing say I'm kicking down at vulnerable groups and minorities. Why are you having a go at gay people? It's like, I'm not having a go at gay. Exactly. Like I'm not kicking. I'm kicking up at these very sort of prissy, pretentious moralists who say that they should dictate how everyone should behave, what they should say, particularly in Canada. I mean, it's not good in Canada, right?
Oh, not good in Canada. Try being at my university.
Right, exactly.
It's absolutely brutal.
Actually, from your perspective, because I'm interested in this thing, we've had this week a group of students trying to get Camille Paglia sacked in Philadelphia, and they were saying they want her replaced with a queer person of color. As though the substance of someone's work or mind is secondary to their racial and sexual demographic.
Look, it's insane, right? I mean, as part of my satirical inventory, I at one point did a SAAD TRUTH clip on my channel where I introduced a new field that I had just founded called social justice mathematics.
Right.
Coming from a mathematics background. And so I used all the terminology of mathematics, irrational numbers. And I argued that to say something like irrational numbers marginalizes people who have, potential mental health issues. And I went on and on and on. And of course, a lot of my mathematics colleagues thought it was hilarious and funny. And the reality is, within a few months thereafter, I often joke about my satire being prophetic. Some woman professor came out and said that mathematics was a tool of the white patriarchy and so on.
I saw that. I've actually quoted her in my book. She's called Professor Gutierrez, I think.
Yes, that's right. She's a Latina woman, or maybe we should say Latinx, right? It should be A-L-T-I.
With an X,
exactly.
Just to avoid offense.
So it's insane. I mean, I use satire, for two separate reasons, I think. Now, maybe three separate reasons. Number one, certainly because it is a very powerful and persuasive persuasion technique. Number one. Number two, I use it for my sanity. It is akin to, it's a form for me to engage in a catharsis publicly, where I mock people, if only to make sense of the craziness. It's like a pressure cooker that you're releasing the valve. And so I use satire just for me to be able to cope with the insanity. And I think,
totally get it.
And the third reason, I think, is because it's a manipulative ploy, because it allows you to evade a lot of the censors. So, for example, I refer to the noble religion. I put it in square brackets, redacted, when I'm referring to the noble religion. And the reality is that the morons that are part of those truth and conciliation committees, or whatever you call them, they haven't caught up to this, and the algorithms haven't caught up. So those are the three main reasons I use them. Would you agree that those seem to be the right reasons to use satire?
Absolutely. I mean, the algorithms are never going to detect irony or satire or anything like that. But yeah, also it just keeps you sane. I had the same thing. I mean, the reason I started Titania was because the stuff was just driving me crazy, and I thought I'm just going to make fun of it. I'm just going to, there is something essentially hilarious about anyone who stands there and says, "I know better than you." It used to be the Puritans, it used to be the Pharisees. Whatever. These people are always, they crop up again and again in history. They don't know how ridiculous and prissy they look, and they deserve to be mocked. So yeah, it's partly a sort of self-preservation thing, but particularly, I'm very interested in your situation, because I think being within the university, things have got so much worse. I mean, there was always I used to be a part-time lecturer when I was doing my doctorate, and there was always a sense in which there was a kind of proclivity for groupthink. There's certainly the case that there were certain cliques of academics at the time. It was the post-structuralists who were all sort of quoting each other to give this illusion that everyone felt the same way, and to sort of challenge that sort of Foucault, Derrida worldview. Because I was doing English literature, you see. That was very much seen as, you were beyond the pale. So there was that quality, and those people were getting promoted and all the rest of it. But now it feels very homogenous. Now it feels as though, you can be completely, you become a pariah, I think, if you don't toe the line. So I don't know. I presume you have tenure, but do you feel like you're under threat?
Thank you for asking. And by the way, I should apologize. I did not know that you had a PhD, so I should have addressed you as Dr. Doyle. So forgive me.
No, it makes me feel I'm a doctor of literature, right?
Well, hey, listen, a PhD is a proper doctor. The medical people usurp that title. Doctor, as you know, is docer, is to teach. So the original holders of that title were not the medical folks. So you are a proper doctor. So
no, sure, but if someone calls for a doctor on an airplane because someone's having a heart attack, what am I going to do? Just I can scan a sonnet for them or something like that, but that's about it,
Right. So to answer your question, people think that because you're tenured, and I do discuss this in my forthcoming book, people think that if you have tenure, that removes all of the costs that you bear for speaking out. I mean, tenure certainly helps in ensuring that I'm not going to be immediately fired tomorrow.
Yeah.
But tenure doesn't protect me from having had to go in with security to campus in fall of 2017 when I was receiving 1 million death threats. Tenure didn't protect me when I had to file a report with the Montreal police because of the death threats.
Of course.
Tenure didn't protect me from many positions that I've applied for recently where people that have 1/10 my dossier have gotten it instead of me. And so, no, it is a very difficult situation. Now, yes, having tenure is certainly, to some extent, offers me some solace. Having a large platform also somewhat protects me. But it's a very, very difficult reality to walk in every day, and having this fractured reality where you know that, if I may say, millions of people support what you do, but then when you walk into your own home, which is your university, you are the black sheep. You are looked at with derision. Why does this asshole keep speaking? Why is he exercising his right? I mean, why is he such a troublemaker, this asshole? So it's a very difficult reality to live.
I think it's all the more important, though, that people like yourself do stick up for saying what you want to say. It becomes a kind of numbers game. I think if there's so few people who are willing to stick their neck out and challenge the orthodoxies, then those orthodoxies will remain unchallenged. And it's really important. And particularly, I mean, you could compare this to satire, for instance. I mean, when we had the Charlie Hebdo case, and at that time, very few publications were willing to republish the images that had led to the massacre of these satirists. Whereas actually, of course, what they should have done is everyone should have published it. At that point, it doesn't matter about the quality of the images. I mean, nothing to do with it. It was a news story. They were relevant. Everyone should have published it to sort of spread the risk. That's what they should have done. And similarly, in academia, I think there's lots of people who are thinking the way you're thinking, but who feel that and understandably, they've got to look after their livelihoods, and they won't speak out. And that really troubles me. But I think the more people do, the easier it becomes.
Exactly. Just to speak briefly about the Muhammad cartoons, Yale University had published a book by an academic on the Muhammad cartoons, whereby they refused to publish the cartoons that the book is about. So the lunacy just writes itself.
Absolutely.
Regarding your point, sort of compelling more academics to come out of the woodworks, I'm always both, pleased, but also I find it soul crushing when professors write to me privately to say, oh, gee, we thank you so much for what you do. Oh, and by the way, please do not mention that I support you.
Right, exactly,
exactly. I mean, you know, that. So on the one hand, you read it, you say, look, you're making a difference. It's wonderful to receive a nice email from, you know, some esteemed colleague and so on. But then once you write that final qualifier or that final, I mean, that shows you therein lies the problem, right? What you
exactly.
It's not even that they're not willing to speak out; they're not willing to go in the public record to say that they support that you are speaking out.
Right, because it is a guilt by association game now. And you'll find there was actually a very good article in the Times of London this week by Neil Ferguson, who's a historian, and he was talking about how we need academics from all sides of the political spectrum to stand up and say, no, we should stop putting pressure on people we need more diversity of thought in universities. And he's calling specifically there on leftists as well, left-wing, and because it's in their interests. Yeah. To stand up and say, no, look, who wants to be just surrounded by an echo chamber because nothing advances that way. I find it really depressing, you know. Yeah. And I mean, I come from a leftist background, which is why I think when I'm mocking the left and I'm mocking the woke movement, I get particular vitriol because they see me as a traitor. Right. But I think I'm not interested in just hearing my own views echoed back at me because I don't refine my thoughts, I don't develop. I don't get anywhere. None of us do. It's like an intellectual death.
Yeah.
You know, I just think I would really love, and I would urge more people on the left to stand up for this principle.
Well, people ask me often, well, why do you spend so much of your time apparently criticizing the left more than the right? And the answer is very simple in my case, and perhaps maybe you'll echo the same sentiments. I exist in the ecosystem called the university, and that ecosystem is inhabited by leftists. Most of the idiotic ideas, most of what I call the parasitic idea pathogens that I discuss in my forthcoming book have all come from leftist academics. So it's not as though there is never a case where there is something to be mocked or satirized by the right. It's just that I'm not as exposed to some of that lunacy, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And the reality is academics and intelligentsia are largely, whether it be in the media, whether it be in Hollywood, whether it be in academia, are very much driven by leftists. So the analogy that I like to give to people who write to me and say, well, why do you criticize the left so much? The answer is very simple. If I were a dermatologist and you come to me and say, sure, doc, I mean, melanoma is important, but what about diabetes, doc? Well, I don't tackle diabetes. I'm a dermatologist, right? So the fact that I tackle the moronic idiocy that comes from the universities doesn't mean that the right doesn't say stupid thing, but that's not my daily reality. It's as simple as that.
Absolutely, and I think that's the case. And I do tend to mock the leftist ideology most, but that's because that's what I want. I want it to get better. I think it's messing up. Like for me, it's sort of a given that the far right are terrible. You know, I'm not a support. It's a given. Like I don't need. Like all these people that say that declare that they're anti-fascist, you know, and you see it in their Twitter, I'm anti-fascist. I'm like, well, yes, no kidding. I would expect that you were. That's my default expectation of anyone is that they're anti-fascist. It doesn't impress me to say that you're anti-fascist. That is a given, right? But this stuff, you see, this leftist woke ideology is well-intentioned a lot of the time. That makes it even scarier. You know, people who think they're doing something good and positive and they're causing incredible damage in society. They're breaking things down. They're dividing us up. And so they need to be mocked, frankly.
Have you had any people who are from the left, your friends, colleagues who are, you know, very much entrenched in the left, as a result of your parodies and your satire, come back to you and say, wait a minute, you know, you made me think, I've changed my position on XYZ?
I would love to say that has happened more often. Unfortunately, I've had the opposite reaction, to be honest. I've had a lot of people who are no longer talking to me since I've started attacking the woke movement. I've had people who've they don't want to be associated with me because I'm doing that, right? So I wish it could be the case. Maybe it is, maybe, but the people who are changing their minds aren't telling me about it because they're not being vocal, you know?
But you raise a good point about... you know, one of the obstacles that I hear people share with me beyond the I'm afraid to speak out because I'm going to lose my job or whatever is I don't want to raise these difficult conversations because I know that I might lose a friendship. And my answer to that, I mean, it sounds maybe banal or cliche, but there is no better way to describe it, is if your friendship with that person cannot withstand the possibility that you might disagree on an important issue, issues, then they're not truly your friend, right? I mean, I don't sit with my very
Yeah.
close friends just to talk about the beauty of flowers. I mean, I want to dig in respectfully, nicely, politely, but you hate Trump. I don't think Trump is so bad. Let's hash it out. I mean, that's what
Yeah.
I expect of a very good friend, right? And if I'm going to lose you because of that, then F you. I don't care for your friendship.
I think you're right, and I think that's the only way you can approach it. The problem I have with that, I suppose, is that I think what's happened is a lot of people, there's something about the woke movement, the social justice movement, that makes people mad. It turns people insane. They've decided in their head that the world is swarming with fascists, and everyone's a crypto fascist. And if I'm mocking the social justice movement, then secretly I must be a fascist. I must have all of this stuff. Now. And I tend to fall out with people because they've sort of intuited what my secret thoughts are. They keep telling me what I secretly think, and I don't think any of those things, right? But if they genuinely believe that I'm trying to spread Nazi ideology, then I guess, I mean, I wouldn't be friends with a Nazi. I really wouldn't. Right. I wouldn't be friends with a racist. I'm not interested in that, and if they really think I am, even though I've never said anything or written anything to suggest that I am, well, then I understand their hostility, but I think it's delusional. And the problem is you can't reason with that. If they've made this decision about you, if they've mischaracterized you to such an extent, then what the hell are you going to do? It's an impossible situation. And the more I say, but I don't think these things you're telling me I think, they'll say, well, yeah, but that's what you would say.
Exactly.
And so their telepathy overrides
reality.
The reality. And it's so depressing, and it's a real infantilism of culture and discourse. I think people are just very simplistic, very infantilized, and I do blame the left, and I do see this as something that has been eroding in academia for many years. I don't even think it is left. I don't think it is left. I don't think it's, as soon as you had the cultural materialists and the post-structuralists coming in and saying, let's take, because they called themselves Marxists. They said, we're just going to take the economy and we're going to replace it with power structures. And we're going to still call ourselves leftist, Marxist. But that's not how the world works, okay? I think to be on the left, you have to be concerned with money, with class consciousness. With the power of the economy, and these people aren't. They're concerned with. They think that you're left wing if you put a gay rainbow flag up on your Facebook page. They think that makes you left wing.
Right.
It doesn't. It just makes you just someone who wants to show off that you're fine with gay people. Well, congratulations. Who isn't?
I should mention I didn't plug your book, which you kindly sent to me, but I haven't had a chance to read it yet. Woke. A Guide to Social Justice. Even though I haven't read it, I'm going to highly recommend it, because if it's anywhere as good as your tweets, then people should be reading it. Maybe you want to tell us briefly about the book?
Yeah, so the book came about because I'd started the account it's exactly a year ago. Okay. I'd started the account, and then when it got to about 10,000, 15,000 followers, I got a book deal off it, which was a very big surprise to me, because it hadn't really taken off at that point. And because my agent actually contacted me and said, we should pitch something about you keep mocking the woke ideology. You should pitch a book. But he didn't know I ran this character, because I was just doing that in my stand-up comedy. And he was like, and I said, well, what about if it's from this character's perspective? And so we pitched it, and it happened. And so by the time I got permanently banned, in November, and then reinstated, what I did, I took that as an opportunity we brought forth the publication date, and we announced it that week. And I pretended, like as Titania, I said, well, I've had 24 hours off Twitter, so I've written a book about my subjugation, Right. And then I wrote an article for Quillette called "Now I Understand How Nelson Mandela Felt," and I talk about because she's such a victim, the character of Titania. She's this posh, really uber privileged, a rich young woman.
And she's got the problematic glasses, right?
She's got the problematic glasses. She's got the blonde hair. She's very stern. She never smiles. She doesn't laugh. And but she's just convinced she's oppressed. She's one of these sort of very bourgeois feminists who's desperate to prove to you what a victim they are. But she's just got absolutely everything. She's got 3 houses, one in the Cotswolds in the countryside. She's got a London terrace, beautiful Victorian house, and she has help. She has sort of Filipino servants and things like that. But she still says that she's like oppressed.
Who is the person depicted in that bio image?
So that was my friend Lisa. Actually created that out of nothing. It has no likeness to anyone, because she amalgamated various women's features and then changed it. So it's not a direct parody of someone. It's a satire of a certain type of person.
What do you think? I mean, you are a professional comedian. Is most of your comedy satirical or
yeah?
Do you have okay? So
I should say so.
So what? do you think that this is something? I think I have an answer to my own question, but I'd like to hear yours first. Do you think that satire, or your ability to dispense satire, is something that is innate, or is it something that could be learned? We can go to satire school to become better satirists.
Yeah, I think you have to work at it. Like any kind of, you hate to use the phrase art form because it sounds incredibly self-aggrandizing, but any kind of art form, music, writing, acting, whatever. The more you do, the better you become. I mean, there's a reason the Beatles became so huge, is because they'd spend many hours and months and honing their craft. And I think with satire, the more you do it, the better you get. You have to know what your target is, and you have to. I think with comedy, I suppose, there's a certain kind of lateral thinking that enables you to write jokes and enables you to think of things that aren't immediately obvious. And that's, because comedy's all about the surprise element, But some people I've seen start out and they want to be comedians and they want to be satirists and they become that. So yeah, it's about working at it. And I think it's a really good way to puncture the powerful and people in authority hate being laughed at.
I mean, although I would fully agree with you that with more work you get better at it. I think if we take Martin Luther King's oratory skills, with his early speeches and look compared to his later speeches, I think you might probably see a progression that he's improved, and so he certainly worked at it. I know that Lionel Messi, arguably the greatest soccer player ever, works hard, if not harder than most. But I think you do start off with an innate ability. In other words, there's no amount of training of how to be a satirist that I can dispense to someone who is otherwise humorless. And so if you buy that premise that, some people just have whatever innate set of skills that requires you to produce satire, person A has it and person B does it. And if you agree with that premise, what do you think might be some of these personality traits? What are some of the correlates that describe why you and I could be good satirists and others can't?
I mean, if I think about all the people I know who are really good comedians and really good satirists, I suppose what they've got in common is they don't like being told what to do. Okay. I think that's what it is. There's that artistic impulse to want to kick back, and I think everyone has that to a degree. If people say you should be doing one thing or thinking one way, you'll go the other. And I think that marks satirists out. And they're not satisfied with the way things are. They want things to actually be different.
And maybe I would add, could it be that there's a sense of irreverence, right? There's an irreverence. There is a type of indignation, right? I mean, I wake up and I'm indignant at endless attacks to the truth. And so therefore I look at my weaponry. What are the weapons that I have in my toolbox today? So I can try to make whatever small contribution I can make to the battle of ideas. And here I'm going to pull out my satirical knife. And so you have to be indignant. You have to be irreverent. Without that sense compelling you, then you can't produce the satire that you do.
I think that's absolutely right. Nothing moves forward unless there's irreverence. Mischief for its own sake can be quite good, And I always like the comedians that have that kind of quality of a saboteur. Right. They want to change something in the way, the kind of Lenny Bruce idea. The kind, I always because one of my favorite playwrights is Joe Orton, who was very famous in the '60s. And died very tragically at a young age because he was beaten to death by his lover, actually. But he used to play these pranks, So he did these very shocking plays on the London scene, very sort of shocking plays that attacked authority figures, like the church, like the government, like the police. But he used to, and lots of people hated them. There were big groups who were trying to stop these plays, and he used to write letters to the press under a false name, complaining about his own plays, saying that they should be banned. And he had created this character called Mrs. Edna Wellthorpe. And she was this very sort of uptight middle-aged woman who was very angry about the plays. And he would get these published in the mainstream press. And I love that kind of idea, that kind of, it's mischievous, but there's also a point to it.
Well, the mischief is actually something that I really can relate to. In my satirical work, two of the best accolades that I've had is when I've been able to convince mainstream media that something that I had written, they don't even get that it was satirical. And so I'll just share two quick examples with you. So in one case, Richard Dawkins, who's a compatriot of yours, you know who that is, yes?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah. So Richard Dawkins had written out a tweet saying, I'm sitting here listening to the beautiful bells of the church, whatever, and it's so much more beautiful than, the aggressive sounding Allahu Akbar. To which I replied, and I want to write to you. I want to read it to you. Dear Richard, Arabic is my mother tongue. This is me speaking. When properly translated, Allahu Akbar means we love all people but hold a special fondness for Jews, women, and gays. Don't worry, it's a message of love, tolerance, and liberalism. So a bunch of media, Newsweek, Pakistani newspaper, all took that as proof of how Islamophobic he is, because here's a guy from Lebanon, a guy who speaks Arabic, who's telling him this. And then when they found out that I was being sarcastic, they all started changing it and deleting it and so on.
That's incredible. But I love that, because what that is, it's that thing of signaling the absurdity enough, but keeping on the right side so that some people will believe it. You know,
exactly.
Like if you have any kind of knowledge of, you'd read that and be like, okay, it's a joke. I get it. It's not real, but enough people will believe it, and that's the best for me. I've enjoyed that with Titania as well. Like I often get into arguments with people, mostly sort of rabid Trump supporters who, you know, real kind of angry people who take us completely seriously, and she'll argue with them.
But in your case, though, don't most people know that it's a parody account, or are people arguing with you because they don't realize that it's a parody account?
A lot of the time, people don't realize. Okay. I think now it's harder because more people know who she is. And now that most of her followers are in America, and it was easier before. But every now and then, I'll hook someone. You know, I'll say something absolutely outrageous, and so you know, something like, I'll say something like, you know, if we eliminate heterosexuality, future generations will thank us for it. You know, and you'll get people saying, this is ridiculous. Don't you understand that heterosexuality produces babies? And they'll take it completely serious and explain the joke back to me.
And then you feel a great sense of accomplishment, don't you?
And then she'll argue with them. She'll say, no, you're just a bigot, you should be in prison. All this sort of stuff. And it goes back and forth. And sometimes I publish the screenshots of the arguments. I find that really, really fun.
Yeah. So
and I know it's a bit of a prank and it's at someone's expense, but I like that. I also like it when, like, legitimate mainstream, like, for instance, I had Titania complained about a major bank, the NatWest Bank, and they replied to her and said, we're taking your this seriously, we apologize. I had an American talk show host invite her on because she took something she'd said literally. And I love that. It's, you know, it's funny.
Let's see if you can beat the next accolade. I told you I would share 2 accolades.
Okay.
Here's the one that I think currently places me as the king of satire, but I think you are catching up quickly. So PJ Media listed one of my quotes as among the 20th most idiotic quotes, and really it was really in a Hall of Fame bunch of morons. But of course they took it as I'm being serious. So here's my quote: "To all noble undocumented immigrants, we apologize for our bigotry and racism. It is Nazism to not allow you to vote in our elections. After all, national borders is Nazism. Nationhood is Nazism. In a just world, everyone should get to vote in any district. Hashtag we apologize." I got to number 6 as the most idiotic moron by PJ Media when they found out that it was satirical. Without putting any editorial comment, which they should ethically, they removed it and replaced it by something else.
Okay. All right. I love this competition. I've got one.
Go!
Okay. Yeah. So there's a very famous, in Britain, there's a very famous magazine called Private Eye.
Okay.
And Private Eye is the satirical magazine of Britain. It's been going for a long, long time, you know. And they have a section called Sude's Corner, where they put the most pretentious quotations that they find in the mainstream media every week. And I got Titania into that because they took it seriously. She was advertising her book and she was saying, do not buy this book for me, but for the sake of humanity. And they thought it was real. So what's good about that is a satirical magazine got tricked by the satire.
Oh, that's double. That's a double thing. So I think I might have to tip my hat to you as the champion.
So that's quite a good one. But they were really cool about it afterwards. They emailed me and said, you know, we got caught.
Nice.
That's fine. They even did a little cartoon mocking her.
What do you think of, speaking about, you know, mocking, satire and hoaxes, what's your position on, and especially as someone with a PhD in English, you would certainly be familiar. Are you familiar with the SoCal hoax? Do you know what that is?
No.
Sorry to have put you on the spot there.
That's fine.
Alan Sokal is a physicist who in 1996 wrote a hoax academic paper and published it in one of the leading postmodernist, you know, highbrow bullshit academic journals. And
I've heard of this, yes.
Right, so it was a hermeneutics approach to gravity, whatever. And then after it got published, he said, oh, oops, let me admit to you that it was all, you know, bullshit. And
yes.
so fast forward 20 some years later, there is now the very famous grievance studies.
Grievance studies,
right?
yeah.
So what's your position on that? Do you think that, because some people who tried to take them down said, oh, they engaged in fraud because
they didn't.
Good, thank you.
I think it's the three of them, wasn't it? It was Peter Boghossian and
Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay.
And I think what they've done is a very valuable service to academia.
Yes, sir.
Because what they've done is they've exposed how easy it is to get utter nonsense published. I mean, one of them was just a feminist transcription of Mein Kampf, wasn't it? I think it was. Some of the stuff is just, and of course I know that they're now, one of them is being investigated by his own university to see whether he's perpetuated a fraud. Exactly. This is not. When I was doing my doctorate, my supervisor, I had two supervisors, and one of them was a brilliant man called Robin Robbins, who did the definitive edition of John Donne's work, and he's a brilliant guy. And he said to me, the thing is, if you learn the right words, if you say the right post-structuralist jargon, it will get published, because the publishers haven't got a clue what you're saying.
Yes, exactly.
And we have a thing in this, or we had a thing in this country called the research assessment exercise. And what it meant was that academics, the more they published, the more points they got, and the more likely they would be to get picked up by another university and promoted, right? So they were just churning rubbish out, to get, and it didn't matter what it was. And I learned, actually, even as an undergraduate, that if you just deployed the right jargon, if you used the words like hegemony and discourse and discursive, praxis, matrices, and phallogocentrism, whatever, right? And you throw those words out there, it didn't really matter that you had nothing much to say, right? It didn't matter, because you could just window dress it with all this jargon, and you would get a first, you get a top mark, right? And the same happens now with, I mean, I do think it's sort of going out of fashion in universities now, the post-structuralist, in a literary sense. But there was all this stuff, just rubbish getting published, And I mean, in the book, I've actually, at the start of every chapter, I quote a legitimate quotation from someone. One of the chapters has a quotation from Judith Butler.
Oh, yes, the Queen.
Incomprehensible nonsense.
She won, actually, I think, some award for the most convoluted, useless sentence, right?
That's where I took it from. That's
exactly it. Okay,
I was trying to make that point. But I've read her book Gender Trouble, and I saw her give a talk, and she was really articulate, smart, brilliant, interesting, and funny, right? But when she writes, it just is obscurantism. It's just this. In Gender Trouble, she says effectively in that book, she's talking about the performativity of gender, right? She makes an argument that could be condensed within a page. But she does it over the course of 200 pages and makes it as sort of flowery and garrulous as possible. And it's not useful. I have to say, it's not good writing. I'm sorry, it's just bad writing. And academia is sort of plagued with this. You get the high marks by writing the right code. It's very depressing to me. Well, it's not elucidating anything.
I mean, as a psychologist, one of the things that interests me is what would have caused this to start off and be allowed to perpetuate itself. Like, how could such a fraud proceed for 40, 50 years? And so I have a couple of theories, and I'd love your opinion on them. So first, I think that the grand French postmodern bullshitters, Derrida, Lacan, Foucault, and the rest of those schmucks, I actually truly believe that in the deep recesses of their minds, they knew that they were promulgating a fraud, so that when they put their heads on their proverbial pillows to go to bed at night, they were sort of laughing their way to fame. So that's number one. And I'll ask, hold your opinion for a second.
I'm holding that thought. Yeah.
Right. Number two, I think that the only way they were able to have this fraud happen is that there's something in psychology called the fundamental attribution error. So do you attribute, for example, successes internally and failures externally, right? How do you attribute something, right?
Yeah.
Well, when I'm sitting in the audience and Jacques Lacan gets up and starts with the eigenvector of my transposed self as a reflection of my hegemony, right? Once he starts doing that, I have two options at that point. I could either think to myself, he's an utter fraud, or I can say, I am simply too dumb to understand how exquisite and profound what he is saying is, and I'm going to go with that. And it is precisely these two things that allowed this incredible collective bullshit to take place. What do you think?
You are absolutely right. I mean, I don't know about the motives. I wouldn't want to speculate about whether they were deliberately perpetuating a fraud or not. But the thing is, I think that's absolutely right, is that people are fearful of looking stupid if they claim not to understand something. And I certainly, because, you know, I did the undergraduate course in English, and then I did a master's and then the doctorate. And by that point, I'd read so much of this stuff. Because, of course, at the time, literary theory was all about post-structuralism, you know, and it just, you know, the more of it I read, the more I realized it's built on feet of clay. It's absolute nothing. There's nothing to it. Right. It is just a group of people saying things in very elaborate ways, quoting each other continually to give this illusion of incontrovertibility. But actually, it's all bullshit. It's not true that there's this thing, that there's no inherent truth beyond the language with which it is expressed. You know, this logocentrism idea of Derrida, it's simply not true. Anyone who says that doesn't understand visual arts, for one thing, or has no kind of connection to human emotion. It's none of it is true. And it's like Camille Paglia says about Foucault. You know, he took a little research a very long way. Right. I think the way she describes it, there's a brilliant article by her called Junk Bonds and Corporate Raiders, which was back from the 90s, and she's talking about this problem in academia, and she calls them, I think the phrase is flim-flamming freeloaders, which I think is a really great way to describe it. But she's reviewing a book by David M. Halperin, which was called 100 Years of Homosexuality, because they were obsessed with the idea that there was no such thing as a homosexual until the word was created to describe it, right. Which is utter nonsense, right? Okay, and they say this again and again, this point. Halperin wrote a book called Saint Foucault. It's a proper hagiography, you know, and it is like a faith. It's a religion. All of this is based on a faith. You know, it's a faith-based premise, isn't it? And so that's also why it's impossible to penetrate, because it's like telling them their God doesn't exist. They're not going to have this. So they're not going to go without a fight. So
do you think that eventually, and you're right to have pointed out that they're sort of slowly dying out. Do you think that eventually it's the old, you know, once the old guard dies out is when a new paradigm comes in? Or how do you see the trajectory going?
So here's the problem: is that I think it's become quite outdated within universities, within literary theory and academia. Okay, but the problem is it's sort of drip fed into the mainstream, right. And that's why you get now self-described leftists who aren't really leftists, social justice activists using the language. You hear the language they use, discourse all the time. They use discourse all the time. Hegemony, they use it all the time. They're constantly banging on about power structures all the time. They think they can explain absolutely everything through power. It explains a lot of things. It doesn't explain everything, and they think that they can do that. And that is a kind of watered down, half understood version of Foucault, isn't it? It's a kind of, we're going to grab the little bits of it, but it's not even on Foucauldian terms. It's not a sophisticated analysis, but that is the progeny. That's where it's come from, right? So that's now a problem, because you've got people peddling stuff that they only half understand, right. And it doesn't matter if they fully understand it, because the worst religious zealots are those who don't have a full grasp of the theology which they're espousing. That's so true. And so it's so difficult to combat that now, because I see it as more dangerous. This thing which has originated in academia and has transitioned now into the real world. I hate to say that, but you know what I mean. Mainstream. How do you challenge that? I don't know, and I think it maybe has to come from academics. If that's where it starts, if you guys can plant the seeds for the next generation, then that is, I think, the way things tend to work. So I think it's incredibly important what you do and what people like you are doing.
Thank you so much. Why did you decide not to go into academia? Is it partly due to the realities that you faced, or you just weren't interested in going down that path?
Well, I was all set to do it. You know, I was teaching part-time. I was teaching the Shakespeare course to the undergraduates at Oxford, and I was at Wadham College. And my supervisor, Robin, he said to me at the time, he actually said to me, "Don't waste your life." He said, because he was getting quite disorganized. He said, "You'll end up running around the quad when you're 80 screaming, 'Why have I wasted my life?'" And I thought, okay. I mean, he was quite dramatic like that, which I loved him for. But I think it did hit home to me insofar as I think teaching and I think academia is some of the best thing you can do with your life, actually. But for me, I found it quite a lonely existence, and I spent a lot of time in the Duke Humphreys Library at Oxford with these manuscripts, and I felt a bit like, in the dark, and I felt a bit like, and also, I was more and more, I was getting into comedy, and I was writing comedic plays and comedic sketches, and I went down to London to put on lots of comedy shows. I got into stand-up, and I thought, actually, this is what I want to do. I'm going to make myself poor. I'm going to go in there and have, there's no guarantee of any kind of career when you go into the creative arts. It's always a bit of a minefield. But I thought, I'd do that. I ended up having to teach at secondary school to sustain myself as well after that. But, you know, I think it just wasn't for me. But I admire people who do it.
I'll come back to comedy in a second because I've had a postdoc who studied scientifically humor, and I'll come back to that in a second. But there's a way to link my areas of scientific interest, the evolutionary behavioral sciences, with literature. And so let me discuss it briefly, and then I'd love to have your take on it. So, of course, depending on your ideological lens, if you're a postmodernist, you'll analyze text one way. If you're a Marxist or a feminist, you're right. But of course, there is a way that you can analyze text in a perfectly scientific way if you presume, as I do. So in several of my books, I talk about cultural products being fossils of the human mind, right? Human minds don't fossilize because they're organic, but the products that human minds leave behind are fossils. So I could study an ancient Greek tragedy that was written 2,500 years ago in a completely different time where people didn't know what iPhones were or planes were, but the software that their brains are operating on is identical to the one that you and I are, right? And so therefore I could look at universal themes that drive literature and apply the Darwinian lens. And so there's actually a field called Darwinian literary criticism. So someone like Jonathan Gottschall, I don't know if you know him, he's a big guy there. And people have applied it in different areas where heretofore you would have thought evolutionary theory could not have been. Art, for example, right? There's a gentleman that wrote a few years ago a book called The Art Instinct, right? So I think there is a way to have a rational scientific approach to studying literature. What's your sense on that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think what you're saying about how the universality of human experience as conveyed through literature is something that I would subscribe to. It became very unfashionable for a while. It was known as liberal humanism, and you'd have people like F.R. Leavis promoting this idea, the universalities. But I think it's true. What you say about, there's a really beautiful poem by Matthew Arnold called Dover Beach, where he is looking at the waves and he's imagining Sophocles looking at the Aegean, and it's the same experience. And I think it's worth looking at that poem. I think that to me just makes sense. We haven't evolved that much that our software is particularly different.
Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
And also, you read these ancient texts where they describe human emotions and human feelings, and it's it's like something's grabbing hold of you, and you're thinking, that's what I feel.
Exactly.
This is explicating something about my own human experience, and you've been dead for thousands of years. Right. There's something quite exhilarating about that, I think. So
dominance hierarchies, status competitions, parent-child offspring, paternity uncertainty. All of the there's probably 7, 8, 10, I don't know the exact number, main themes that cut through most of the literature that captivates us, right? If the literature that you're reading, I mean, short of you reading something that is complete escapism and fantastical, but even then I would argue that if you distill it, it's probably related to some fundamental human nature, right?
This is why I think when we talk about identity politics and the way it currently runs, there's a connection between the way that people have been analysing literature for so long in terms of new historicism and that kind of approach, where you'll say you cannot understand this because culturally you are not connected to these people, right? And it's this idea of insider epistemology, which it takes one to know one.
Right.
I don't believe this. I think it's a really sort of nihilistic worldview. If you say we all have to be divided up because of lived experience, that is what the essence of identity politics is. Whereas actually, I think there is a common humanity which is key to our being, and I think that comes across most notably in literature. And I think there's something really beautiful about that. I'd say with the approaches of analysing literature through a scientific lens, I think there's something really interesting about that, and I would be interested to read that kind of thing. At the same time, I think it's worth always not losing sight of the poetry of the emotion, and I worry that if you try and overly quantify or reduce emotion to mathematical abstractions. It can rid the artwork of its very purpose of being, you know. And there's a way to do it. There's Oscar Wilde wrote that piece called the Critic as Artist, you know, and he's talking about this idea that that actually the act of criticism, the act of analysis, can be in itself an artistic endeavor. Right. And I think that's really sort of a beautiful thing.
I've heard very much the same concern intimated in different ways. So, for example, some will argue if you study romantic love scientifically, as evolutionary psychologists do, you're removing some of the mystique, some of the magic. Yeah. And I'm not sure that that's true, right? I mean, my heart will still palpitate in the same way when I see my wife, even though I might know the neurotransmitters. Yeah. So I don't think one precludes the other.
No, it does. It doesn't. And there's Richard Dawkins did a really good book about this. Was it something to do with the rainbow? Unweaving the rainbow? I can't remember.
That's right. Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. And he talks about this idea that actually having an understanding of the way that the world works scientifically doesn't necessarily obviate a poetic interpretation of that world. Exactly. Or the fact that the fact that sexuality and love, it obviously, evolutionary speaking, we are driven to reproduce and perpetuate our genes. But that doesn't mean that love in itself is not a beautiful, wonderful byproduct of that. And I think art is what makes life worthwhile. And yeah, it probably does come. It does come from these very mechanical impulses. But yeah, I think there is a way to enjoy both at the same time. Absolutely.
Coming back, as I promised I would, to comedy. So one of the things that evolutionary psychologists study is mating preferences. Why do we prefer these attributes in women and men? And of course, you often hear women, in describing the ideal man that they'd like to mate with, they say, I want someone who is funny. And the reason for that is because being funny is a proxy measure of intelligence. I mean, it's very, very unlikely that you could be funny and be an utter moron, right? Because to be able to make these comedic observations, you have to think synthetically. You have to be able to draw, to be able to use satire and so on. So there's this argument that humor is a sexually selected trait by women in choosing men. What's your view on that?
Well, I haven't even thought about that, but that's a really interesting point. That humor is a signifier of intelligence, and therefore people are attracted to intelligence. And maybe. Although I know some pretty stupid comedians. I have to be honest. But,
don't name them.
No, I wouldn't do that. Well, I mean, there might be something in that. I mean, really, I should just be fending off potential lovers, shouldn't I? If that were the case.
That's not happening, you say.
That's interesting, because people don't get into comedy for the sex. I don't think, anyway. Because of course, at the same time, part of our job is to make ourselves look stupid, right? I mean, we are clowns. We're maybe that is alluring. I hadn't ever thought of it.
Do you? Well, before I ask you this question, I'm going to tell you a short story. So I've had the privilege of becoming friends now with my childhood musical hero. I like a particular type of music called the Philly sound, which is a type of soul music that came out. Its genesis comes from the late 60s and early 70s in Philadelphia. There were some musical producers. And so that probably the epitome of that genre, the prototypical group from that genre, is the Stylistics, which is a group that had many. Okay, exactly. Well, the lead singer, who is someone who sang in my ear growing up in Lebanon as a child, has become a friend of mine, which is absolutely it's unbelievable.
I think they did a Betcha by Golly Wow, didn't
exactly. That's the Stylistics. They have many hits. I mean, legendary group. I asked him. He came on my show, and I asked him whether before he starts a performance, whether he's nervous. And the reason why I was interested in asking him this, because I was hoping that he would say yes, and then I would use that to explain to my academic children, my students, to explain to them that when they're about to go and present, it is perfectly normal and natural that you would get butterflies. In other words, I wanted to kind of demystify the experience of the fact that you feel stressed before you perform. If someone with world fame, such as the lead singer of the Stylistics, can feel nervous, well, it's normal that you would too, right? And he basically said that, he has a hard time standing. He's so nervous. This is a guy who, played with James Brown and Michael Jackson and so on and so forth. Right? I mean, he's the epitome of the top star, and he's nervous. So having given that intro, do you get nervous? Do you get the butterflies before you go up in front of the audience?
I find it so interesting, because some performers I know, the nerves really help them, and some of the most incredible performers who you think are just incredibly confident, But the thing, I mean, I actually don't anymore get nervous. I used to. I don't anymore, and I think it's really helpful because with stand-up comedy, the confidence is 90% of it. You know, an audience is not going to relax enough to laugh if they're worried for you. So if you'll often see new comedians who maybe they're shaking a bit because they're a bit worried, or their delivery is off because they're nervous, and it makes the audience less likely to laugh because they don't trust them,
right.
And that's something everyone has to go through early on in their career. It is the illusion of spontaneity and the illusion of confidence. But here's the key thing: is that you don't have to be completely free of nerves. Some of the best comedians still get incredibly nervous. I remember seeing an interview with a British comedian called Jo Brand. She's hilarious, and I saw her being interviewed, and she said, you know, I always get nervous when I go on stage, but because she's got a background as a psychiatric nurse, she used to have to just look really tough, even if she was absolutely terrified, and she applied those skills to doing stand-up comedy. So she'd say she'd still get nervous, but it's the fact that the audience can't see it. That's the key.
Right.
And it massively varies. I don't get nervous anymore. I don't know why. I think it's just, I don't know. I just sort of think to myself, you know, what's the worst that can happen? You know, like, people are not going to laugh at me. It'll be humiliating for now, and then the next day it'll be fine. So I found a way psychologically to get through that, so I don't get nervous. And also now that I've played in such big rooms, I guess I feel like, well, if I've done that, then it's okay. But some of my favorite stand-ups do get nervous. They feel physically sick before they go on stage, and they're brilliant because they can disguise that.
Right. Now, do you when you're up there, so 2 separate days, you're delivering the exact same set. Something happens such that on day 1 it works, day 2 it doesn't. Could that be something that live can make you nervous because you deliver the joke, you don't get the feedback? Could that send you into a sort of spiral of doubt, or you just kind of move past it?
Yeah, it can do. This is something you've got to learn as a stand-up. Is that we've all had so many experiences where you do the exact same material in the exact same way to a different audience, and the reaction is just the polar opposite. And you don't, because audience is a weird beast. You know, it's almost as though the sensation in the room is contagious and collective, you know? So if you've got a group of people who are really enjoying it, that will spread, and people will feel almost like they've got permission, because we all know that if you're in a group, you're much more likely to laugh at something, yeah? And so stand-up comedy is the only art form which really, really depends on this feedback from the audience, this actual audible feedback, which you don't need in a drama or a piece of theatre, say, you know? You don't need that. But we do need that. And sometimes, I remember doing a gig, and it was one of the best of my life. And I was previewing a new show, and it went so well. And I did the same show the next night in another venue. And within 5 minutes, I thought, I'm not going to get them. There was no laughter. There was nothing. And it was the same material. And I had the same technician. And he said to me, that was so weird afterwards. He said to me, you know, I was listening to the same jokes I'd been laughing at the night before, and they weren't funny anymore. Right. I was like, well, the material was the same, but there was an atmosphere. Do you know what I think it was, though? That room was actually, it used to be a crypt for dead children. And I think that's probably what it was. I honestly, I have that feeling like there was some sort of, it's a converted room in London. Wow. But maybe that was it. I don't know. But it's fascinating to me that so much of the stand-up, the success or the failure of stand-up, is in the hands of the audience, you know? They say never blame the audience. I always blame the audience, right? If you're not laughing, it's your fault.
I'm assuming you know who Joe Rogan is?
Yes.
Yeah. So I've been on his show many times. We've had, you know, great chats. I think it was maybe on my first appearance on his show, maybe 5 years ago. Yeah. Where he made an observation that has stuck to me till today. Hence, I'm remembering it to mention it to you now. Here's his observation. He said, you know, as a stand-up comic, it's him speaking now, and as someone who, you know, was into fighting, right, the MMA stuff and all that, it's very similar to the job that you have, Gad. Because when you are a professor, you have to get up and you have to speak, and you get the immediate feedback. You're either a bullshitter or you know what you're talking about. When you get into a ring and you're fighting, there is no hiding from the truth. You're either going to get pummeled if you're a faker or not. When you get up in front of a crowd, and you're either funny and people respond to you or not. And I thought that was such a brilliant way. It's a synthetic way to bring all of these different professions under the guide, under the rubric of, it's difficult to bullshit when you're a professor. I mean, unless you're a postmodernist, but if you're a real professor, you know, truth is going to win out. And so if you're espousing bullshit, people are going to find you out. what do you think of that? I mean, there's a real truth dispensing quality to comedy. You're either funny or you're not.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in your job, you're going to have people constantly challenging your views
Exactly.
to your face as well,
Exactly.
and asking you to elaborate on your views, and that's a really healthy thing. I suppose in comedy, that's why you can get some acts that work well on television, but on television you can re-edit, you can dub over the laughter, you can do all of that stuff. You put someone in a club, in a late night bear pit club at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, they better be funny, because if they're not, it will become immediately apparent. And that's why it's always very bad for acts if they get picked up if they're very fashionable, right? If you have a fashionable act who gets picked up by an agent very soon, and they're too soon, and they haven't really developed the craft, and then they get put in these very high profile club nights. And the audiences in those nights, they don't care who you are or who's behind you or which television company is interested in you. If you're not funny, they won't laugh at you. And that can be
the truth is going to come out right there.
It's really. I saw a very famous television act at the Comedy Store in London, which is one of the big comedy clubs in London, and it wasn't going well. And I thought to myself, but he's so successful. Why is that? And it occurred to me he just hasn't honed the craft yet. Yeah, he'd only had like a year on the circuit or something, and it just wasn't there. You need years to make it work. But yeah, I suppose there is something in that.
Do you find that, I don't know how many countries you've performed in, but do you feel that there is a cross-cultural element where certain types of humor might work in countries A, B, C, but you move to X, Y, Z, and that genre doesn't work?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I found when I was in Norway that the audience were really listening, like so much more than they do in England, and they were picking up on wordplay much more than they were when I was doing stuff at home. Some of the jokes that I put in sort of just to entertain myself, they're a bit smarmy maybe, but playing with words in an interesting way. They'd really get it and they'd respond very quickly, and that's quite interesting. I've never performed stand-up in America or Canada, which is something I'd really love to do, because I get the sense that the audiences there are very, or I'm told by people who have done it that the audiences there are very different. And I would be interested to know whether my type of perspective would come off well over there. I have no idea. But
are you planning on doing a tour in North America?
Do you know, I'd love to eventually. I'm not planning on it at the moment. I've just done a tour of the UK, but maybe I should. Yeah, why not?
Well, if you come to Montreal, you'll have to look me up.
Well, I'm putting together a live show for Titania, which I obviously wouldn't perform. I'd get an actress to play her, but it'd be interesting to see how that would work over there.
Have you ever seen me when I come on camera wearing my social justice warrior red wig?
No, I have not. But that's something I will definitely look out for.
I should mention, and I know we probably have to end soon, but I think one of the reasons why professors don't, engage in greater satire and humor and so on, I think they're under the misguided notion that they need to always stay in professorial facade, right? I mean,
right.
I should always be... I'm always pontificating. I'm a professor. I'm Dr. Sad, right? I should be smoking a pipe. I should be dispensing knowledge. And somehow to be funny, to be self-deprecating, to joke around, to engage in battles over Twitter is less than professorial. I despise this kind of smug elitism, right? I can be I could go to Stanford Business School and present there, and I can also joke around and exhibit all of my humanity.
Absolutely. I think humor and comedy, that's how we relate to each other, isn't it? That's and that's surely you're not degrading the post of professor by engaging in a joke every now and then. I would hope not, anyway.
Right.
A lot of these academic conferences I used to go to, people are just desperate to be entertained, ultimately. And if you've got some dry person up there who's just sort of spouting all this cant that he's lifted from Foucault, no one's going to be entertained. We've heard it all before. Give us a joke.
Right, exactly. So tell us, before we end this chat, Andrew, what are some projects that you're currently working on that you might want to use this forum to promote?
Yeah, well, I think at the moment it's the Titania live show. I want to kind of develop some kind. I know what her character is like in my head. I want to find a way to realize that on the stage. So I don't know whether it'll work or not, but we'll see. We're going to do that later in the year. I'm also working on a couple of music. I've written a musical version of Huckleberry Finn, a piece of musical theatre with a musician in Northern Ireland called Duke Special. And we've written it, and we're looking to see whether we can get that on. Just doing various things like that, really. And I'm ongoing doing stand up and doing my political articles for Spiked as well.
Well, I will continue being a fan of your unbelievable parody account on Twitter. Thank you for entertaining us. And thank you so much for agreeing to come and chat with me. Stay on the line.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Real pleasure talking to you. Cheers.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.